Many congratulations on your new book. There's already a lot of debate has been generated, uh, specifically on demonetization, and I know you want to talk about a lot of things, but a few questions that still remain unanswered. We'll first get over with it soon, and then no, some we are hoping that there are answers that can come from you. In the book, you talk about the RBI handed a note that outlined the preparations that would be needed and the time that would be required should the government decide to go for demonetization. What were those preparations that it outlined, and what was the time frame it kind of indicated?
So I have a sort of duty not to reveal specific communications. I talked about the demonetization view simply because I understood there was a question asked by Parliament, and I thought it was important Parliament had the right answer. But that said, let me step back from whatever note was given and not represent what was said there. I'm not saying it was in or not, but I will say that as a monetary economist, what you would like to see in any such exercise is that if you are intent on going about it, the day you do it, you should be ready to replace all the currency you're withdrawing with an equivalent amount for the transaction purposes. So you may withdraw, let us say if you're withdrawing 100 rupees worth, 70 was used for transactions, well, you should be ready to replace 70 that day. So for example, we've seen the cash demand now is tapering off. Yeah. We should have been ready with this kind of amount on the day we did it. The less you are ready, the more you have to print in order to sort of roll out the currency, the more economic life is disrupted, right? So to the extent you cannot replace it immediately, you find transactions falling and GDP growth falling.
So in a way, we saw this cash situation getting kind of normalized. It almost took them for the ATMs to normalize at least up to end of March. Yeah. So in other words, what you're suggesting is that it would take that kind of time, and that is what should have been kept in mind.
And remember that RBI mints and the government mints were working at double pace or triple pace, yeah, with army involvement, this, that, over this period. So that time was compressed relative to what it would have happened if there hadn't been that sense of emergency.
Now, on the preparations front, so this is one set of preparation. Do you think there were also preparations that were needed to kind of prevent some of the ways people probably got around it, and as a result of which we saw that almost 99% of the cash came back?
I think one could have thought of some of those ways and figured out ways to prevent that perhaps. But human ingenuity is pretty significant in India. We are a very clever people, especially when it comes to, I think the word is jugaad. And as a result, if people know how to fix things, you have to ask whether you can overcome every one of those fixes. So the real question you have to ask is how easy is to prevent all this? And if it's not, what is the amount you're going to cash through this process?
Was it aided by frequent changes in rules? Did those things create more loopholes?
I can't comment on that because I wasn't here, I wasn't watching it closely. I would say that this is an exercise that has never before been attempted in India. I say never before, even though we had a demonetization in 1978. That demonetization was really of notes which are not used for transactions. So given that we're doing something new, obviously there would be some changes that would be made in that process. I don't want to comment.
Some learning would come as you
go. Some learning would come. You would learn. You would figure out that there are some loopholes. You would try and close it. I think that goes with the territory of it being new. So I don't want to opine on that particular.
You said there were other alternatives available to achieve the same goals. What could have been those alternatives?
See, longer term, what you want to, first, the intent of getting greater tax compliance is a very important, worthwhile, noble intent. We need to do that in this country. So, how do you do that? I think in the longer run, you may want to deal with the stock, but as important, if not more important, is dealing with the flow. You want to create much less incentive to create the black money and much less ability to hide the money that comes. One way is to reduce the space in the financial sector for hiding this black money. So, for example, seeding all deposit accounts with Aadhaar, which the government is doing, is an important way that you, of course, the Supreme Court has opined on Aadhaar and indicated there are some needs for safeguards, and we should put those in place. But if you can figure out where the money is going, and you have a complete picture of the individual's holdings, then I think you have reduced the compliance problem. So there are ways like this where you reduce the space the person has to hide. That would be the way to go.
You do not necessarily need a move like demonetization to achieve this. The more
I think if you're dealing with the flows, you don't need to work on the stock as much.
So this is kind of addresses the stock question primarily, and there also we don't think we have seen much of success now that the data is.
Well, we have to wait and see what the income tax department does with this kind of information about where the money has come into which accounts. Now, given that an amnesty scheme was also proposed and the money came in despite that amnesty scheme, presumably some amount of hiding has gone on. That it's not as obvious as you see the money in the account and the fellow confesses that this was all illegal money. So some effort will be required in other things. This how much can it withstand court battles and so on. At the end of it, what comes back? It remains to be seen.
In your book, you talk about how you felt that the short-term economic cost might outweigh possible longer-term benefits. What are these economic costs other than a possible slowdown in GDP in the immediate quarters following demonetization, or the transactional costs that were incurred that we saw, or the inconvenience? Were there any other short-term economic costs that you?
Well, again, stepping back and not saying this was in any communication to the government, one of the costs which people haven't paid enough attention to is this was money sitting, if you believe it was black money, it was sitting in people's safes or in their basement. It wasn't earning any interest. So the government was effectively getting an interest-free loan from people who held this cash. Once it gets into the formal system, if you haven't identified it as bad money, these are people gaining interest on it. So you're paying people for now their black money because they put it back in the system. Now, I point this out because this is something that people misinterpret. They're saying we have formalized the savings. No, the savings were there. They were just financing the government free of cost.
In other words, if the expectation was there were about 300,000 to 400,000, 3 lakh to 4 lakh crore dodgy cash, you probably ended up paying 10 to 12,000 crore at a savings bank interest rate, or probably more than that.
4% would be 16,000 crores on 4 lakhs. But remember the RBI is sucking this excess liquidity out at 6%.
Yeah.
So it's about 24,000 crores then.
On an annualized basis.
On an annualized basis. And that's what you have to pay every year if it stays in the system and doesn't go out as cash.
So that's a cost we have taken on which we don't.
So when
realize.
people sort of thump on the table and say we have formalized this, I think they misunderstand what cash is actually. Cash is a liability of the central bank and is therefore a form of financing for the government because the central bank makes money on the fact it has a zero cost financing and invests in government bonds, etc. And that difference is paid as a surplus to the government. So the fact that the RBI surplus has come down by 30,000 crores plus suggests that this is not an insignificant cost. And over and above note printing and note cleaning up and so on, this cost has to be taken into account.
What were the possible longer term benefits that?
I think tax compliance has to be the biggest benefit, that if you can get better tax compliance, I mean, every finance minister complains about all these Mercedes floating around and nobody actually paying taxes or nobody paying large amounts of taxes. And better tax compliance in this country would give us more sort of resources to make the kinds of investments that we actually need. That has to be the single biggest benefit. The others are more minor. I mean, digitization is a good thing, but would happen. I mean, digital transaction growth has been happening quite strongly.
Psychological impact possible? People would be less inclined to hold large amounts of cash now?
Well, there can be positive and negative. Positive is if they sort of avoid hiding income. Negative is if they're worried about spending or investing because they fear the tax authorities. And we are at a point where we have fairly weak growth. So better that we incentivize the positive aspects rather than the negative aspects.
Last question on demonetization and then we move on to economy. At the time when it was done, do you think the timing could have been different to yield different results? In the sense, there has been a suggestion that the Indian economy was in a very healthy state actually to take on such a measure. Was it the other way around?
Look, I mean, I'll just make a comment not on demonetization, but whether the Indian economy was healthy, given the GDP numbers at that point. Remember, we had a re-evaluation of growth based on the new GDP numbers from the old GDP numbers. What was 5% in the old went up to 7%. In the quarter before demonetization, which should have been about the last quarter reading, it was about 7.5, 7.6. So 7.6 was about 5.6 in the old reading, which few people would have said is hugely strong. So I think it would to say that we were back to the old strength, which was 7 or 8% in the old numbers. I mean, again, you can't do this exercise as crudely as I'm saying it, because but would require, I think, stronger growth than 7.6. So I don't know what people mean by healthy. Private investment has been falling for some time. So until we see private investment pick up, our industrialists are not voting with their rupees on the health of the economy in a positive way. They're holding back. I think that would be a true test of health when we see the private investment picking up strongly again.
Be that as it may, we are now, the Indian economy is caught between the rock and the hard place. What do you see as the way forward?
Well, first, I think on the positive side, a number of reforms have been undertaken, some of which, like GST, may have a short-term negative effect, but hopefully in the longer run will have a very positive effect. So we have undertaken reforms. We have established a little bit of a reputation for doing the reforms. I think going forward, 3 areas of concern which we need to tackle very fast: the twin balance sheet problem, the balance sheets of the corporates as well as the balance sheets of the banks. We need to tackle that in a very strong way. There was task forces to revive some of these stalled projects. Can we revive the task forces in a much stronger way? That would be one. The second sector I worry about is the power sector, that there is where there is incipient weakness. We need to make their work, not just on the financial engineering side, but on the real side, bringing down the line losses, increasing the tariffs so that we have fewer of our power producers going sick. And also we should be careful to avoid renegotiating, especially for these renewable producers, renegotiating the power agreements. Third place where I think there is still some weakness is exports. Why are we not doing better when the rest of the world is picking up in its exports? This is not, earlier one could have the argument that the rest of the world was not doing well, but exports are picking up throughout Asia, and we need to ask why we are not picking up as strongly. So those are three areas of weakness.
What is your understanding or assessment of why we are unable to get exports back on track?
I don't know. I mean, one of the areas of success in the past was engineering exports. I don't know why they are not picking up as strongly. Maybe part of the reason is we're not part of global supply chains to the extent that we ought to be. But that's not is not a compelling explanation. So the answer is I don't know, and I think it's important to find out. But exports has been an area of weakness and of underperformance. Also remember that in terms of growth, we haven't had any further benefit from lower commodity prices, which have been a big benefit over the last few years. So, and ultimately, I think for the medium term, we have to improve the quality of our education system, of our skill building system. Without that, 10% growth is a dream, which we will find it hard to achieve. We need to accelerate the process by which our children learn and learn in an effective way.
As we speak, private investment remains sluggish. Gross fixed capital formation in the last quarter grew at about 1.6% compared to 7.9% a year ago. How early do you see a turnaround in that? As you said, if investment demand doesn't pick up.
No, the good news is it can't stay low forever. At some point, people have to start replacing old capital and so on. Ultimately, the strength of demand. Remember, capacity utilization also is not that strong. So strength of demand will define whether people start investing once again. But that's just one factor. The second is confidence that in fact there are no surprises left, that in fact as they invest they will get support and things will become better. I would say that perhaps some efforts there are still warranted.
Do you have concerns on the inflation front?
I don't know enough, and I don't want to comment on the monetary policy itself. So I think on inflation it's better that I keep quiet.
How has it been going back to teaching, Professor Rajan?
See, research and teaching is my profession. Is fundamentally what I do, and it's been fun re-engaging with students. I have a lot of Indian students in Chicago. Some people say, why don't you teach Indian students? Well, I'm teaching Indian students, except I'm teaching them in Chicago. But we're also working on a new university in India, building out a new liberal arts university, and some of my time here spent on that. I'm very excited about the possibility of creating a new environment for.
You're looking at a full-fledged university, in liberal arts. That's what India needs.
Well, it's. I think we have a lot of engineering colleges, but we need more universities like Ashoka, and that's one of the things I'm working on.
You didn't want to teach in India when?
I've taught in India. I teach at the ISP, and I'm working very hard on another book, but this is on more on economics, not India, but more global issues. But once I've done that, I will engage in some other activities here, including teaching.
Well, thank you very much. I know you have a tight schedule. You have the book lunch coming up in the evening. Wish you best of luck.
Thank you.
And keep talking to us.